Thank you, everyone, for joining another episode of How I Franchise This. We are going to mix it up a little bit this week, and we have someone who's from the franchise industry, but is really a value add provider in helping you navigate the process of buying a business and everything that comes with the legal side of that. So we're joined by Adam Wasch today. Adam, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you do a quick intro and share with the audience what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis?
Thanks, Alex. Appreciate you having me. I am one of the founding partners of the franchise firm. We are a boutique franchise-specific law firm based in Florida, and we also have an office in the Northeast, up in Pennsylvania. We specialize in all things franchise. I spend my day representing close to 50 or so startup franchisors and emerging brands, anywhere usually from true startups to about 250 units. That's our sweet spot. My partners also represent about the same number of brands. And the rest of the day, I also represent franchisees looking at various brands, both greenfield, new franchises, development deals, and also existing franchises. I do the M&A work to help people acquire single units or multi-units. Those are the three main areas of our focus, but really anything that comes up on the franchise legal side, including trademarks and corporate work, we handle.
Awesome. I appreciate the intro, and for the audience, we did not coordinate us both by or wearing our black quarter zips today, but love the branding. I want to take it back to young Adam, or younger Adam, I should say. What led you to wanting to become an attorney and a lawyer in the first place? Where did that journey start for you?
Good question. I actually started out thinking I would be the next Jerry Maguire. Sports agent extraordinaire. I graduated from UF, Florida, in Gainesville. And during that time, I worked in sports, minor league baseball to be specific. I interned in Brooklyn for the Brooklyn Cyclones after my junior year. And then after my senior year, I worked in Savannah. And I'm sure your audience has heard of the Savannah Bananas. But prior to the Savannah Bananas, there was the Savannah Sand Gnats, and they were much lesser known and not as widely attended. But I worked at that stadium where the Bananas now operate their international, baseball dynamo. It's crazy.
Did you overlap at all, or how many years did you miss it by?
I missed it by. Not to date myself, but when I was there in 2003, we were the single A affiliate of the Montreal Expos. So if you can imagine, the Expos have been contracted in 2005, but the Bananas, I think, got their start around 2016 or 17 in the early days. And so, yeah, I missed it by about a decade, but but from there, I worked in a couple of years, 3 more years in minor league baseball professionally before going to law school. So when I went to law school, I was really kind of hoping my experience in sports was going to kind of translate over into some sort of sports agent or, that type of career. But I quickly realized that it's a very tough business, obviously, and I actually enjoyed being a lawyer more. Law school is really a good period for me to get my chops as actually being a lawyer. I worked for a few firms and always understood that working and not just studying the books was going to kind of carry me through to my professional life. So had a nice leg up working for a couple firms during law school, and then kind of shot out of the gate working for a pretty big size litigation firm doing mostly commercial litigation, trademark related matters. And that's where I got my start.
All right. So I'm sure, some people when, they're looking at buying a franchise, they might also be wondering like, why do I have to use an attorney or, what's the reason for engaging with someone like you? What is your, typical response to that? And what do you wish they understood around the importance of leveraging someone like you in this process?
Yeah, I usually say that I'd much rather speak to someone before they sign than have to speak to them after they sign, and maybe things aren't going well, or what they understood to be the deal wasn't actually the deal. What they understood to be the level of support wasn't actually the required support under the franchise agreement. What they understood to be the numbers to be weren't actually the numbers. So there's a lot of conversations that I unfortunately have to have after the fact of, in the what I'll call dispute resolution part of my practice, that I could have had before for a lot less money and a lot less, a better period of time with an open mind, because you've got an opportunity to make a decision. So, I generally believe that whether you hire me or you hire anyone in the franchise bar, it's a lot of good lawyers out there that are in the ABA franchise forum, that are actively involved speaking about franchise issues and really developing the body of franchise law that you could hire to do this. And generally it's penny wise, pound foolish not to.
Mm-hmm. And is there something that you think buyers, typically through this process worry way too much about? And then on the flip side, is there anything that you think they don't worry enough about or spend enough time focusing on?
Yeah. To take the latter part of your question, I think there's just a general sense of, because it's a franchise, there's some safety net or security. And I think, like, because there's an FDD, because the founders have, launched what they would call their franchise system, then, because there's an FDD in front of someone's looking at it, it looks all prim and proper and has all the bells and whistles of an FDD and looks official, that the franchisor has their systems in place. Their, the model is proven, and therefore, if they just sign on the dotted line, that they're going to find success, like it might say in the item 19, which is the financial performance representation section for those that may not know. And I feel that there needs to be some objective voice in the back of the investor's mind, or that is helping them understand what brands, are really have everything in place here that you sign, and you should have some expectation of success, versus the ones that are just basically going to Vegas and putting your money on black or red and hoping for the best. And unfortunately in our business, there's so many options and so many people with different incentives and motives, that, a franchisee prospect could have 5 different brands, put in front of them, and all of them may not be the right fit or the right, model or the right, opportunity for that particular franchisee prospect. So, long story short, I think people don't really do their investigation in a way that would protect their money, and they just sort of jump in without guardrails. And that to me is interesting when I'm speaking to a franchisee prospect about what they've done to understand and validate up to the point of even speaking to me. And many of them haven't even spoken to an existing franchisee, or haven't done anything besides flip through the FDD, or run it through Chat GPT and getting a little summary of what's in it. But yeah, there's just a kind of a lack of understanding uh, uh, and trust and too much trust placed in the people that are incentivized to sell franchises,
Yeah.
I think.
And then on the flip side, is there anything that you think people maybe worry too much about or put too much, stock in or, anxiety in, on the flip side?
I think people should be anxious. I think people like should feel, that this is a very important decision because obviously there is a lot of upside that could happen in buying franchise. And I've seen some amazing developers, get into brands early, and brands that are, more quote unquote sure things that have done amazing things and scaled their portfolios. And I enjoy that side. That is my, I feel so good about helping people achieve their financial goals. Unfortunately for me, I also get to hear the downside of it, and there just isn't enough being talked about that downside. And so when I'm the one who has to say that to people, I get accused sometimes of being too negative or too, why are you trying to kill deals? Like my goal is 100% not to kill deals. I enjoy when folks find the right fit for them and understand what they're getting into and prosper in whatever franchise system they buy. But I just have some scars. I've seen folks that have not been successful and have, had faced financial ruin and that happens. So I bring all those experiences to my process and to my discussions with franchisees, and I feel like it definitely benefits them. And if they proceed, fantastic. If they don't proceed and they tell me, listen, this was valuable to me in understanding what I was never told before, and just seeing it objectively, what's actually on the paper that I'm about to sign, and thanking me for not pursuing it is, as valuable to me as someone that does proceed and does well.
All right. So when you're, helping clients look through FDDs and franchise agreements, are there any specific industries where that legal review is more complicated or higher risk than others, or is it all pretty standard across the franchise industry?
I think it gets more complicated when there's regulation upon regulation, and those are industries like the medical spa business, where you've got not only the franchise laws and regulations that need to be complied with, but you also have medical and health laws that are the franchisee is going to need to understand. And the franchisor certainly needs to understand it as well, but the franchisee is going to need to have potentially a medical or health lawyer help them set up their franchise LLC, for example, as like a medical services organization. I know a little bit about it because I've represented a few med spa brands and do currently. But that side of the law, the health law side, is a whole other cottage industry that needs to be understood. There are other businesses like, in the trades, the service business, commercial, residential, where you've got to have like a contractor's license and it's those issues that, I think a franchisee prospect really needs to understand before getting into it, the kind of, potential costs of legal, and also there are certain, one example of the one time that I told a prospect not to do a certain franchise. And I don't say this, I don't say don't do it. I present the risks and I want the franchisee prospect to make their own decision, right? Whether they proceed or not. But the one time I said don't do this was a license issue where a short-term rental franchise was selling a franchisee prospect a territory where the laws in that territory were such that short-term rentals were illegal. you know, like, okay, that's a short-term rental business. Your goal is to manage your primary objective is to get homes to manage and to rent out to short-term on through the platform. And but the territory, and I knew this because I happen to be the territory where I live, and I did a little research, suggested that you could not even have short-term rentals at all. And plus, there's a lot of homeowners associations in the area that would preclude these types of contractual arrangements. And of course, the franchisee didn't listen to me and and proceeded anyway. And of course, that was the quickest call that I got from a prospect after the fact, saying like, "How do I get out of this?" And that question is very hard to answer. And certainly I can address that in response to another question. But yeah, so to answer your question, I think the regulated industries are the ones that should be looked at with more scrutiny.
Okay, that's super helpful. I didn't even think about, like you said, regulation on regulation is going to just inherently add complexity and, likely more risk. I want to switch gears to like the actual agreements and FDDs and some of the insight that you have there. You've probably reviewed, for sure, hundreds, if not thousands of FDDs and franchise agreements. What's the first thing that you actually look at right away? Like you're doing a review, is there a section? Did you go to item 19? Is there somewhere that you're like, this is where I go to see, gut check the health of the agreement of the franchisor?
Yeah, I've actually first looked to item 20, which is, how many franchisees are open, and what the future looks like with respect to growth. And why do I do that? Because it gives me a good indicator of whether or not I'll be able to score some points in a negotiation for the prospective franchisee.
Yep.
So that's the first place I look. Nothing, you've seen kind of one FDD, you've mostly seen them all from a structural standpoint. Certainly, some firms have their own quirks of how they, put different disclosures into the FDD. I like to play the guessing game of who drafted the FDD and certain, styles of fonts and little stylistic elements. I'll be able to tell like, oh yeah, 17.1.8 says XYZ, and I'll flip to the back of a brand I've never heard of. And of course I'll see that provision. That's kind of the level of knowledge I have over other firms' FDDs, and certainly I draft my own. And I'm sure, people that do this that aren't me, have seen some of my FDDs and kind of see my own stylistic elements to it. But yeah, I look at item 19, of course, item 7. I spend a lot of time in items 2, 3, and 4. Item 2 being, who you're dealing with. A lot of brands are founded by operators, right? And operators can be great franchisors. But from a risk perspective, you generally want to see operators, surrounding themselves with maybe some franchise people, right? Someone, people that have been there before, scaled brands before. And it's not to say that is the litmus test for success. There are tons of brands, in the startup phase to 100 units that are still led by their founders, and good for them. But I do find it interesting to, from a whether a new brand is going to be able to scale the backgrounds of the people that are running the franchisor. And of course, items 3 and 4, being litigation and bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. I do a deeper dive into that, and I don't necessarily trust what I see on paper. No litigation needs to be disclosed in this item. Well, okay. What are other things that I can look for, right? I can look to the federal docket and see, hey, were there any bankruptcies on the federal docket in this brand that don't need to be disclosed, but maybe should be discussed with the prospect, just to understand the risks of what happens if you fail in a franchise. That bankruptcy is certainly on that list of things that could happen.
And does it,
And if there's a hot or bankruptcies, then obviously that's potentially a bigger risk factor than others.
is that publicly available information? Like anyone can go look at that, or do you have to have, is it like LexisNexis where you have to have a login and an account?
Yeah, the federal dockets are on something called Pacer, and I've got an account. I've always had an account. I used to litigate a lot in federal court, and so I would basically be on Pacer all day, so I know my way around it. You have to pay per page or per search or whatever, but it's kind of nominal. So yeah, but it's just an added benefit that I give to my clients to do that search, to just see if there's any newer litigation, or I check all the affiliates. I check all the people in item 2 just to see what they have in their background. Because I could tell you, I've found in the past issues where, like a 9-year-old bankruptcy was conveniently omitted from FDD that requires bankruptcies to be listed for 10 years, and I've made, in my litigation days early in my career, I've made entire, I'll say I've made mountains out of molehills on those issues of finding disclosable items that were omitted that a franchisee would want to know about before signing up. And it's a pretty cut and dry issue that, could be the quote unquote get out of jail free card.
Yep.
For a franchisee that's struggling in a system. So I focus on that. I like to know who my clients are dealing with. I've never had any prior interaction with the brand and don't know it, because there are so many brands out there that I learn of new brands every day. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's my main focus. But I do go through everything and put together like a Cliff's Notes of the FDD for the client, and we go through that, and I've got a pretty good library of of FDD review memos, and it's continuing to grow.
And something you said earlier, I'm personally curious on, and I think it's really smart. You said you go to item 20 to see your kind of growth trajectory, how many have opened, closed, but it's also an indicator of, hey, how much wiggle room do we have to negotiate? Is there, because I agree, emerging brands are more willing to do that. Super mature brands, you almost need them more than they need you in some cases at that point. They have more leverage, et cetera. Is there a cutoff or a ballpark where you're like, hey, they've got more than X open or more than X sold, they're not going to negotiate? Is there a general rule of thumb that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, generally 50 or more. I'm not really asking for anything.
If they're open or sold?
Open.
Okay.
Yeah. I think a lot of brands that are selling fast will also shift their negotiating wiggle room almost in real time. I mean, I can tell you from experience, like I've in some of the hottest growing service brands, I happen to, and this happens often, I happen to get a referral, and then it ended up with another referral and another one, and I ended up doing 10 franchisee prospects in a single system, where I was doing a funny story. I was doing 2 different, so my process is not, again, it's not cookie cutter. It's really the review is objective, but the risk assessment is based on who I'm talking to, right, and their background and what I learn about them and their nervous points, and what they're looking to do. Sometimes it's a retiree looking for a second career. Sometimes it's an MBA that's looking for kind of a first shot at business ownership. And so, an aside story, I represented 2 franchisee prospects in the same system, and had the same call on the same day. One in the morning, one in the afternoon. And the first guy was like, this is crazy. I would never do this. Thank you for opening my eyes to this and the risks and all that stuff. And then the other guy bought a 10-pack. So, and it just shows that some people's risk tolerance are much higher than others. But to go back to the question, the brands that are growing like that are, whether they have an FSO, which is a franchise sales organization, or a broker network, or, a platform where you get a lot of eyeballs, and I'm not naming any particular online platform, but I know one. Early on, there may be an addendum, that I suggest some bullet points of negotiation, and I maybe get, 60% or 80% of my asks. And then I'll take that list, and, the next guy I represent, I'll be like, well, I've scored this point, this point, this point, but I can't predict what they're going to do now. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a shifting, like we go from negotiating an addendum to not even negotiating at all, almost very quickly. And that's, that happens in brands that are selling fast. So it doesn't necessarily indicate, 50 units open, who cares? If you've sold 100 committed, odds are good you're going to then also not score any points in negotiation.
Yep. So you've shared some of the things that, you look at as, risk points or potentially weak points. Is there anything that a strong franchisor does in their legal docs that instantly jumps out to you as like, all right, they're on top of it, they're structuring this, very thoughtfully and intelligently? Is there anything there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't spend a lot of time reviewing mature brands, FDDs. Mature brand FDDs are usually a lot different than the startup and emerging brands, in the sense that they're all going to be one-sided, in favor of the franchisor and protect the franchisor. But the disclosures are much different. Like, for example, Subway has, 60 pages of litigation. If you saw that if you see one or two litigations listed in an emerging brand, you're like, oh God, red flag. But for Subway, like, who cares? It's Subway. You kind of know what you're going to get, and really dependent upon, not only the acquisition of the unit you're buying, or the, to the extent there are new territories, I don't think there are, it's Subway. Same with like Popeyes and Tim Hortons through RBI. Like I've had the pleasure of representing franchisees in those systems, but the FDD is terribly one-sided, and the franchise agreement is I mean, it's the most one-sided, tight agreement that, prevents a lot. And, but you can outweigh the risk there, because you're getting into a brand that has proven success and a lot of track record, and there's ways to validate the system beyond those risks. But you don't have that benefit in the startup and emerging space. Mm-hmm. And regardless of whether or not it's mature or emerging, the emerging brand FDD is still, once you sign it, like it's very restrictive on a franchisee, as you know. So there isn't really much difference between a startup FDD from a control and one-sidedness perspective as compared to the McDonald's of the world. And a lot of people don't realize that. They just think, oh, it's a new brand. If it doesn't work, I'll just kind of get out of it and walk away, like no harm, no foul. Well, you're not only committing to the capital to invest into the franchise, but you're also committing to a 10-year relationship. Yep. And franchisor has expectations over those 10 years that you're going to be paying them royalties. And if you don't honor that commitment, the franchisor is you're going to have some problems.
Mm-hmm.
And, then you also have the non-compete as well, which is going to be both in-term and post-term. And you can't just take the name of some brand that no one's ever heard of and put up, Bob's Pilates. You can't do that.
Yep.
Because you just found yourself on the bad end of a lawsuit.
Yep. That's super helpful. I want to ask you some, of your thoughts and insights on just industry trends in general and franchising. I mean, you've been around it for, a decade or more, and you've seen a number of things. Are there any trends in franchising today that worry you?
That I think I've talked enough about what worries me. What is interesting to me is the interest of and you used to have to grow your franchise system to, let's say, 100 units was like kind of the sweet spot before strategic investors or private equity would come and say, hey, we're interested. What I'm finding is, as a startup franchise attorney and having clients that are, some growing fast, some growing strategically, there's a lot more interest in smaller brands than there used to be in years past, and a lot more capital being devoted to helping startup and emerging brands get to the next level. So, what we're finding is, I've had deals where strategic buyers have bought some of our clients that have, maybe either recently launched just a franchise program at all, or have sold maybe a handful of units, but have good tailwinds. And so that's really exciting to me. And what I didn't really see 10 years ago, but what I'm seeing now, like, I'm out there, I'm on, of course I'm on Twitter, and people sort of know how to reach me. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, I've been approached by some of the biggest names in franchise development who have started up their own kind of holdco of a particular subset of franchise brands that are looking to acquire brands, and certainly I represent brands in almost every industry. And so they go to my website. It's almost like a menu, I list all of my clients and their logos, and I'm like, yeah, just, keep sliding through. What are you interested in? And then I can make that connection, and whether it happens or not, it's still a good, sort of kickoff discussion for, potential future acquisition. And I think that's exciting to me. And I wasn't seeing that 10 years ago. So it's a lot more money in that kind of next level of franchising, and people are very excited about, the multiples that they get from getting into the right brand early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, before Franzi, I was a franchisor of a laundromat concept called Laundrolab, and we talked to a number of private equity groups, Elk Atherton, Rourke. I mean, the huge ones, all the way down to some of these earlier stage, smaller market, mid market, funds. And you're completely right. It was even then, and that was 4 years ago. It was, we don't really want to talk to a franchisor until they have 20 locations open, so still less than 100, but, there is this gap, or there's been this gap, I'd say, from people that are maybe 5 units open and they need capital to jump to that next level of enough units open to sustain royalty, have royalty sufficiency. And it's exciting that private equity and some smart money is starting to get interested, because I think it's a net good for the franchise model. Do you see the involvement of private equity changing how agreements are being written or how things are being negotiated at all, or has that not influenced, FDDs or FAs at this point?
Yeah, I don't. Short answer is no. I don't see the difference generally in terms or in disclosures. item one, which lists all the transactional history and the affiliates, that gets a little bit verbose and sort of almost difficult to follow as holdcos start to acquire brands, as you have to disclose, everyone in the portfolio, and the litigation history gets a little bit murky. You have to decipher whether it's related to that franchise or, other franchises in the portfolio. But, other than that, the way that founder-led franchise disclosure documents are drafted, those are almost mirrored after the ones that are, being drafted by the big firms that represent the private equity backed brands. There isn't really much difference in the way of royalties, initial fees, protection of the brand. Those were pretty consistent. And it's only really when I see FDDs with terms that are like, I call not market, it's rarely a private equity backed FDD. It's usually a startup backed, or startup or emerging brand with a lawyer that isn't necessarily counseling their client in a way that would bring them back to reality.
Yeah. Well, just as we're coming towards the end of time, I wanted to ask a couple of questions on your kind of reflections on everything you've learned in franchising and some of your advice, and not official legal advice, but some of the advice you might have, as people set out on this journey. And then we'll wrap with some kind of quick hitter questions. But the first reflection question I have is, what's something you wish every first time franchise buyer knew before they reviewed their first FDD or got into this process?
That just because a concept has an FDD does not make it a proven system, or that doesn't make it a model that if you were to buy in and sign in the dotted line, that you'll open with fanfare and success. I think that is probably the first thing I educate my clients on, that you just need to kind of weed through the fluff to kind of understand whether the brand has their proverbial stuff together. And I think that is, and I don't usually use the word stuff, a little more colorful. But I think that is one of the key takeaways that you'll get if you were to work with me on an FDD review.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. What do some of your best clients do that make, that set them up for more success or outsized success? Is there any characteristic, trait, decision they make that you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, from a franchisor level of growth, I'm a big fan of smart growth, not necessarily launching and then running to an FSO or a broker network. I think early on, it's very important for both the franchisor and the franchisees to get their sea legs and iron out some kinks in the system and make the adjustments, and hold on and hope that your franchisees, that even if they're not as successful as you want them to be, that they hold on and trust that you're going to get this right or whatnot. And until you do that, selling to the masses, I find to be a very risky proposition. And, certainly there are some founders out there, some of which I represent, and, that have been publicly out there saying that they've made mistakes early on and needed to make adjustments. And that's very hard when you've got 150 franchisees committed and having had paid you the initial fee or have developed their territory or their unit. And those adjustments are much harder to make. So I'm a big proponent of strategic growth. I have had some clients that have deployed that super successfully, one being Scenthound, which is a dog wellness brand, and just very smart and steady growth trajectory. As they started to build their franchise network, they started to build the team, and the team is super solid. You know, they've taken on some investment, but that's important, and something that I usually talk to my franchisor clients on early on about what the next steps are.
Yeah, that's incredible advice. I mean, one of them is we in that, fall into that camp of making that mistake. We sold a few of our first deals organically because my co-founder and I thought, hey, if we're gonna ever hire anyone to do anything, we should at least know enough about it to be dangerous, to know what we're looking for, to know what pitfalls to make. So we sold the first few deals on our own, and then we eventually did start working with an FSO. And even then, it was probably too premature. We were a mix of 50% organic deals, 50-ish% broker, which I think is fairly good when you're working with brokers. We did a lot of podcasting and outreach, but we got to a point where we looked at each other and said, we got to go focus on getting stores open and building out the team and, growing more responsibly. And even at that point, it felt like we should have made that decision, a few months prior. Because it's easy to get into that almost treadmill of, you got all these deals coming in and you're growing and it's exciting, but it doesn't matter in the long run if you aren't doing it at the right pace and the right level of thoughtfulness. So I think that's a huge piece of advice, because no one's going to tell you to slow down. You're going to be excited. The brokers are going to keep wanting to go. The FSO is going to want to keep going. When we told our FSO that we were doing that, they said, we've worked with dozens and dozens of franchisors. You guys are the first one that's actually stopping and slowing down, and it's the right thing to do. And I was like, if it's the right thing to do, why don't you tell every brand to do that? but the incentives are misaligned, as you mentioned. So
right, 100%. I think the incentives being misaligned is a key part of our industry that I'm able to. I see it. I can see the 40,000.
Foot view and see it happening.
View of the industry, and there are a lot of misaligned incentives throughout our industry, and I think figuring that out, whether you're the franchisor or a franchising prospect is you would never know. So speaking to people that are knowledgeable about the industry that don't have incentive one way or the other is key to future success on both sides.
Yep, I agree. Well, to wrap up, I've got like 4 or 5 like quick hitter, one sentence or so type of response questions that are more just fun and engaging. But the first one is, what's the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen in a franchise agreement?
What's funny is, and I know these are quick hitters. I think I need to preface this answer. It's more so like, for me, what's not in an FDD and what's not in a franchise agreement. I find that the way brands are sold not being reflective of what's actually in the franchise agreement or in the FDD, and how uninformed a lot of early founders or salespeople are on the actual franchise relationship, to me is usually the most ridiculous thing that I see. For example, I saw working with a prospect on a newer wellness concept, and they're selling it as they are going to manage the system after launch. Like, they do everything for you from start to finish. All you got to do is pump the money in. And to me, that's ridiculous. Because that's not in the FDD. It's on the franchise agreement. I don't even think it's a real franchise. Certainly the SEC may have some issues with considering it a franchise, but it's more so what I've heard compared to what's actually in the FDD itself. Because usually, again, you've seen one FDD, you've seen them all. They're very cookie cutter for the most part. And you don't really see too many ridiculous things in the body of the document. Certainly within the body. You know, I've seen $85,000, you know, initial franchise fees, $100,000 initial franchise fees, those sorts of things. You know, I perk up my radar to say, hey, that's a little non-market, or, you know, percentage-based fees adding up to something like 20 to 25%, and plus, you know, flat fees that, you know, you just wonder how a franchisor or how a franchisee could make it in like a boutique fitness concept, paying, you know, 30% of their gross back to a franchisor or an affiliate. I mean, those are ridiculous to me, but, you know, I really think it helps when franchisors have, good counsel, good, you know, consultants, good, lawyers that can kind of rein in the ridiculousness and give the franchisor a good chance for success and their franchisees a chance for success. So that's my answer.
Yep. Awesome. And all right, so the next one, if you weren't a lawyer and you didn't have the franchise firm keeping you busy on a daily basis, what franchise would you go buy tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, I like acquisitions of brands. I'm a big fan of the auto care industry. I listened to your podcast with Brian Beers, who I have, you know, a good business relationship with. You know, he's in the Midas brand. I've done a lot of acquisitions for Meineke and Take 5 Oil and those sorts of brands. I think essential services is where I would do my focus, and I think those are good businesses to not only acquire but be able to scale your portfolio. You know, I'm a big desserts fan. You may not notice from my you know, my physique, you know, but I've always dreamed of having like a donut shop or a, you know, an ice cream shop or a ice cream, you know, truck. And, you know, one of our newer clients, Frios Pops, does a nice job. I could see myself kind of driving around, you know, just kind of, you know, wind in my knot hair and, you know, enjoying myself. But you know, I'd want to get into a brand that, you know, is a passion of mine, and that's fun. You know, Shayna Denny's doing a good job with Dog Drop, and
Yep.
and that's like also a cool concept that I would be passionate about. I've got a couple dogs myself, so, you know, you go down my Rolodex of clients and say, hey, this is great. These, you know, these are great, but yeah, for me personally, I think you know, things that I feel passionate about are, you know, pets and desserts.
And essential services.
Also me. Right. And yeah, and auto care services, right? We're passionate about getting an oil change.
They're all super related.
Right.
All
Hot chicken too. And while we're at it, I love hot chicken.
right, if you could make one rule that every franchisor had to follow, what would it be?
One rule that every franchisor had to follow, you know, I think, you know, we use the term responsibility. I think that is a broad term that is being used in our industry now as being kind of, you know, responsible franchising.
Yep.
I think it's truly important that a franchisee and a franchisor understand what they're getting themselves, each of them getting themselves into when signing a franchise agreement. The franchisor should be vetting the franchisee just like the franchisee should be vetting the franchisor. You know, my dad used to use the line like, who are your best franchisees? And he'd say, well, if you put a mirror under their nose and there's vapor, you know, that's who I want to sell a franchise to, right? And I think that's just an old way of thinking. I think that there needs to be an alignment of understanding, both parties wanting to have, you know, success for each other, a partnership, you know, I'll say a family atmosphere, even though it's a little cringe, as I've heard using that we're all one big happy family, but I truly believe that if you feel passionate about your franchisees and a respect and you're in this together, the togetherness aspect of it is important. I think there's too many franchisors that I've dealt with when representing franchisees in a dispute resolution scenario or litigation that, just is in franchising for the wrong reasons. And it just leads to conflict. And I feel like that there's, a sense of responsibility that we all need to have in the industry to make sure people are getting into good situations for themselves and their family and their financial future.
Yep. I agree. I mean, I don't know if it's blanket regulation on a federal level or what it looks like, but something's got to give as far as getting that misalignment less easy to happen and as prevalent as it is. All right, last question, or go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, to that point, like, brands that are telling you that you don't need to hire a lawyer, right? Or brands that are saying, you shouldn't be contacting these franchisees without like an NDA or something like that, things like that, you need to look at that and say, hey, listen, like, you need to give the franchisee every single tool in their belt to make sure this is the right fit for them, because otherwise you're just taking their franchise fee and ultimately you're going to run into a scenario where they feel like they were misled or that they didn't understand what they were getting into. So I really feel like the work that franchisee lawyers do, again, I'm a hybrid, but there are some franchisee lawyers out there that only do this work that know what they're talking about and have the experiences to be able to provide real good advice. The work benefits both sides. It opens the eyes of the franchisee. It may weed out who is ultimately would not be good for the franchisor, and it also helps the franchisor not sign someone up that just will have false expectations. And I think that's important and really, a focus of mine. And I think it lends back to the responsibility aspect of being a franchisor.
Yep, I agree. All right, last one, switching gears a little bit. What's the best book you've read recently that you'd recommend to anyone listening?
Well, we had a good time in Columbia for the Main Street Summit, and we got to see author and speaker Slickhill Bloom. I had the pleasure of reading his book. It really hit home for me. The 5 Types of Wealth. So highly recommend it if you haven't read it. Seal's a great speaker. He's a Twitter personality as well, and certainly, has a good message, and it hit home for me.
Yeah, I was blown away. Just kind of how coherent his thoughts were and cohesive and just super thoughtful. Watching him give his speech on stage and the ability to share that much content and that tight and important of a message the way that he did was one of the more impressive things I've seen in a while. So yeah, go check that out. I agree. It's a good book, and he's an awesome dude.
And also the ability for him to shift his priorities so drastically over time and understanding what is important, to him and his family, and it really, for someone who's, I'll say a workaholic, or someone who works too hard and isn't always present, when when duty calls on the family. So, I think it's just really important to understand that and how he was able to shift those priorities. And it really got me thinking, and I feel like I'm doing a much better job at that in my own personal life.
Awesome. Well, Adam, thank you for taking the time to come on the show and share your wisdom and what you've learned and seen and observed over the years. And if people want to find you anywhere, where can they find you online?
Yeah, they can find me on X at Adam G Wasch ESQ. I'm certainly out there and enjoy that platform and being able to espouse my views on the franchise industry, and also may get some kids sports ditties in there. But that's where you can find me. DMs are always open. Try to be really responsive, and certainly if you have any questions, feel free to DM me or shoot me an email, adam@thefranchisefirm.com.
Awesome. Thanks again, Adam. Go give him a follow, and again, appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Alex. Really appreciate it.